So today, we're going to be looking at Kwame Gyekye's African philosophical thought. Soft fit. The reason I selected this first is because he really does, I think, a good job of talking about things like community and morality and origins and the idea of the creator in this book. So he gives us, I would argue, a good general basis, a good general background of what we're supposed to be as African people, even though African spirituality is inextricably tied to that. One of the things I do want to say before I begin talking about Gyekye is that Gyekye believes in the cultural unity of African people. I think that's extremely important. In fact, anyone who really I'm reading and they have an issue with the cultural unity of African people, I'm probably going to put the book away. Because I really don't want to hear people saying that we are not one. And we are not one at the base. Or for those who are familiar with Mama Rumba, we're not one in terms of an assembly. Okay? That's the heart. That's the spirit of who we are. Okay? So we are one. So even, well, Gyekye did use the word ethnic groups, I believe. I can't remember. But we have people who talk about different tribes, if you will, on the continent as if they are different cultural groups, because we have mystified culture so badly. So we talk about a culture of poverty, we talk about hip-hop culture. These things are not culture. These things are derivatives of a major culture. They're influenced by them, and there's nothing wrong with them in terms of being an entity in and of themselves. But they're not cultures. We've misdefined culture away. So when you're talking about the different groups in Africa, you're talking about different, and this really isn't part of the discussion, but I think it's important, different ethnic groups. So you can say subcultural groups, but they're not cultural groups. They're subcultural groups. Okay? You understand that there is this underlying commonality that we find among all African people who haven't been so tainted that they don't know who they are. Even then, there are bits and pieces of evidences. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of discussion of what we call Africanisms. Those things that African people still had, even though they may not be conscious of it, that they still did. They got carried forth from the ancestors. They get carried forth through the lineage. That's part of us. A lot of these discussions attempted to, but we sort of stayed away from it, attempted to talk about it in terms of genetics or cultural genetics. Things that got passed on from one generation to the next through the genes, but we really didn't want to have that discussion because we had major problems with genetics as a science because of how genetics had been used so badly against us. We didn't even want to deal with it as a subject, as a topic, but it is something that we need to consider. Now, why study spirituality? Because why should we study spirituality? Not just why study spirituality, but why should we study spirituality? Every single solitary book, essay on African people that dealt with, in some way, shape, or fashion, our traditions, stated that African people are the most, and usually the word religious was used, are the most spiritual people on this planet. Whether it was enemies writing about us, whether it was us writing about us, whether it was confused people among us who were writing about us. You always saw that component. You saw that among two other different things, and one of them was that African people are the most family-centered people, ever. But that is always a part of the discussion, that African people are the most spiritual people on the planet. And what that means is that we understand we are more connected to the universe. We are more connected to the Creator than any other people. We always have been, and that's not bragging. It's just the way that we are. It's also reflected in us in European and other people's churches, where we take what they say for its face value more than anybody else, more than they do. We believe in it more than they believe in it. So we are very, very spiritual people, and we see that as who we are. We don't look at spirituality as something that we do on Sundays or something that we do when maybe we wake up or right before we go to bed or when we get ready. We look at it as the way that we are. We do not disentangle ourselves from that. And in fact, also in a number of studies that have been done on African people, when we talk about lineage, most of them will tell you that the oldest ancestor is the creator. Okay, so there's that level of connection, not some distant, far off existence that rules over what have you, but this is connected to us. Okay, which of course brings up another point. Everything that Gyekye says, I don't agree with. I think he makes some very important points, and I think he makes things that we should think about. And I think the problem with some of my disagreements with him, and they're not major disagreements, have to do with the fact that I've been westernized, because I should be able to understand him as an African. Okay, so there are things that I've had to grapple with that he said, and I read this book, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago or so. But still the ideas. And it was good to go back over this book because I can see how he has influenced the way I think about African people. And some of the things that you take on as the way you think, you forget where they came from. Okay, going back through this, so this is a good exercise for me also. Okay, if you understand what it means to be African, then your first interpretation of what I'm saying and putting on the board is going to be from an African perspective. So you're going to be looking for, if you will, those things that distinguish. When you have an identity, that identity is recognizable because of other people's differences. Okay, it's sort of like if you don't have light, everything in space is going to look is going to be invisible because there's nothing that shines on it. There's nothing that you can see without the light. There's nothing that you can see without the light. Okay, so when we're looking at this, we're looking to understand African people, but we have to understand it in the context of something that's different. And we are living in a reality that's very different than what it means to be African. So for a lot of us, that's hard to grasp because this is all we know. And as individuals trained in the West, we've been trained not only to believe these lies, because Western science can prove any lie true. We've not only been taught to believe these lies, but our egos have been bolstered so much that we cannot admit when we're wrong. So it's very difficult for us to change our understanding from European to African. It's much easier for us to say, well, this is just human. Okay, and since the Europeans are the model, then therefore. So, again, African philosophy and Urdu philosophy. I have to ask Mama Marimba how she would change that into a verb like Urdu. I'm going to have to ask her about that. Okay. African philosophy. As African people, I hope you recognize this. As African people, we do not disconnect thought, word, deed. We are not a contradictory people. We despise contradiction. You cannot have a glorification of contradiction in a communal setting because contradictions create divides, pits people against each other. So we are anti-contradiction as a people. We do not like to separate thought from word from deed. And if there is anything in there that doesn't match the other ones, then you are a contradiction and you are dismissed. Unlike in the West, we have become so westernized that we embrace this. So we see people who are supposed to be our leaders, and then they have such articulate, so charismatic ways of stating things, but in their private lives, they are a mess. But we can ignore that because we have internalized this idea that being a contradiction is okay. And in fact, it's cool. And we have glorified that, but that's not our ancestors, and we're supposed to be our ancestors. That's not us. African people, when we talk about holistic, when we talk about the circle, when we talk about completion, when we talk about complementarity, we're talking about a people who was able to understand how everything was interconnected versus having to break everything apart so I can look at it individually and then try to analyze it and understand it. How to put stuff outside of myself and be able to think I can understand it better versus looking at it with me connected to it. African philosophy, African psychology, as Fukuyama talked about, is a perfect example of that, and that's not in there good, so I won't be talking about that later. Where the psychologists in our traditions, this individual went and pulled the whole community together because it wasn't something was wrong with that person, something was wrong with the community. So you analyze the community to see what was wrong with that individual. Versus Western philosophy, psychiatry, you go and you pull this person on the couch and you see what's wrong with him or her. And maybe connect that with other people in their lives. You want to do the Freudian thing. Okay. But for African people, if there was something wrong, there was something wrong with everybody. Versus Europeans, there's something wrong with that individual. So African philosophy is found. Is found in the art, if I may say art, of doing, being, Rimba's coming up in here a lot tonight, of being African. No contradiction, no meaningful contradiction between thought, word, and deed. No contradiction between thought, word, and deed. We didn't believe in that. We didn't believe that you could lie, cheat, steal, say you believe in God, and somehow get away with it because that wasn't seen. If God is omnipresent, then obviously you're busted. Okay? But that contradiction is alive and well in the West. The African people, to be is to be. Black folks we can do stuff with words just like we can do stuff with a wall. Who was that? Was it Roy Ayers or somebody says everything is everything? That flows with us. Everything is everything. We had no idea, but it just felt so good. Okay? I'm old enough to understand what he meant, but it's like everything is everything.
That's Donny Hathaway.
Excuse me, that was Donny?
Yes.
Okay. I can appreciate that. Our philosophy is a compassionate expression of belief. Expression. Heartfelt, soul felt, spirit felt expression of what we believe. To say and not do is a contradiction. That's why we're in trouble with our children. Because they can clearly see the contradictions. They're not stupid. We tell them that they're geniuses, and yet we're going to play them like we are playing other people. They can see clearly. No wonder they run to people who are naturally contradictory. For Yoruba, philosophy is written, it's sterile, it's disconnected from, let's say, your emotional, intellectual self. Something that's written down on paper. There's some sentences, paragraphs, books, and the more that you write, the greater the philosophy. People in the West are so impressed with quantity versus quality. How many books did you write? Oh man, you must be. There's nothing in the books. There's nothing in the books. Okay. For Europeans, to say is to be. Not to act, to say. To say is to be versus to be is to be. Major differences. As far as I'm concerned. So you see a white boy and he comes out and does everything in his power to lock his hair and he's black now. Or what happened, I saw a lot in the 60s and 70s, white folks would go to the reservations and get some an Indian headdress or do some handicrafts, and now they're indigenous people to this land. Okay. To say is to be. So we're talking about a sterile, I keep using that word sterile, must be something there. Objectivity. This word right here is a long discussion. But I'm supposed to be brilliant because I can look at things, and I said outside, I can take myself away from it, take all emotion away from whatever it is that I'm studying, and I can really understand it. That's the Western mind. Separation. Observation after the separation. It's sterile. There's nothing human about it. There's no emotional content. There's no life there. I articulate the truth and therefore I'm brilliant. I say therefore I am. I be therefore we are. It's big difference.